Dear audience, I'm very happy to show the newest results of our study done in the past 12 months, which really focuses on pediatric oncology and personalized treatment approaches. I work at the first Department of Pediatrics as a senior resident, and I conduct research in the second Department of Pediatrics. As a resident and as a researcher, my aim is to eradicate childhood cancer by using personalized approaches. In order to do this, first we conducted a meta-analysis of treatment efficacy in personalized treatments in pediatric oncology patients, and the next step will be analyzing different therapeutical options for very hard to treat brain tumor in pediatrics. So, to assess the efficacy of personalized therapies in pediatric oncology patients, you have to understand this is a very important topic. Why? You heard that reintegration to society is a big problem for survivors, but we can only cure 70 to 80% of the children. 20 to 30% can only be cured with additional therapies, and this is our aim in this study. Our question is, does the additional targeted therapy improve survival in these hard-to-treat patients? Our hypothesis is that it does. So, conducting a search with this above-mentioned search key, you can see that we came up with more than 23,000 hits in the 5 biggest databases. Out of this more than 23,000 articles, we found 236 eligible articles. So when we're talking about outcomes, survival is one of the most important. You have to understand that in the literature, event-free survival and disease-free survival and overall survival are the highest reported outcomes. These are measured from the end of treatment until an event occurs, relapse occurs, or death occurs. So when we're looking at our first outcome, which is event-free survival, you can see that the survival probability favors the interventional group, which is the additional targeted therapy group. You can see that this becomes statistically significant at the 4 and 5 year follow-up time. So we can say that patients have a 0.8 times smaller chance of having an event at the certain follow-up times. When we're looking at the hazard ratio, you can find a 0.82 listed. When we move on to the hardest outcome, which is the overall survival, it also favors the interventional group, so the additional targeted therapy group. You can see that the survival probability is higher in all groups in the 3, 4, and 5 year follow-up times. So we can say that additional targeted therapies do improve survival in pediatric cancer patients. And you can see that the chance of mortality is 0.8 times lower in the interventional group. And now I would like to talk about pediatric central nervous system tumors and the therapeutical efficacy in those. This pool is a bit different to the last two because this contains not only the comparative studies but also the single-arm studies as well. And we can see that the combined therapy with chemotherapy and targeted therapy has the best survival probability in CNS tumors. This can be attributed to the fact that CNS tumors have a high heterogeneity and we need different targets to attack with these medications. And now, one of the most interesting outcomes is when we looked at the adverse events, we found no significant difference between targeted therapy alone versus targeted and chemotherapy combination. Why is this? A lot of adverse events happen in both groups, but our estimation is that there's a smaller number of serious adverse events happening in the targeted therapy group, and this number of adverse events has all of these adverse events listed. And of course, with chemotherapy, we know the side effects, so there might be also a reporting bias when we talk about the number of adverse events in these groups. So to sum up, this is the first comprehensive meta-analysis that contains all the comparative and single-arm studies as well in the topic. The comparative studies focus mainly on hematological diseases, and solid tumors are underrepresented. But the implication for practice is that we should use these targeted therapies early on to reduce side effects from being in a very heavily pre-treated population, because this can also be one of the reasons why the adverse effect profiles are very similar. And the implication for research is that we should come up with high evidence RCTs to further improve survival in these patients. As a conclusion, these should be considered first-line therapies. Additional targeted therapies do improve survival. The best survival probability can be attained in CNS tumors with a combined approach, and we should consider an update of current guidelines. So we finished the data extraction, and analysis is now ongoing regarding serious adverse events and treatment-related mortality. And now I would like to focus on our second topic, which focuses on a very hard-to-treat pediatric tumor, diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma. This is a tumor of the brainstem which controls breathing and heart rate, so it cannot be surgically removed. Therefore, we need therapies that cure this disease, because now there is no existing one. The 5-year mortality is 99% in these kids. Our question was that is there a best of all approach to target these very hard to treat diseases? Our aim is to establish a clinical protocol for this treatment. So our progress is the Prospero registration has almost been done, and our search key is almost finalized. And to sum up, we would like to eradicate childhood cancer by estimating and proving that additional targeted therapies do improve survival, and also looking at diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma and its treatment options. And we should never give up hope to end childhood cancer, because hope is being able to see that there is light despite of all the darkness. Thank you for your attention.
You said that maybe later for first-line therapy we will recommend targeted therapies. And have you ever read or have you any information about targeted therapies as first-line therapies, and in what diseases they can use it already as first-line therapies instead of chemos? And I'm just curious about your opinion as a second question, that will the time come when chemotherapy will be replaced by targeted therapies?
Thank you for your question. These are very interesting questions. Actually, there are treatments that are very effective now in solid tumors, for example. One of them is dinutuximab in neuroblastoma, and we are planning to actually have clinical trials with this drug, but this is a topic of my colleague Mark Hernat-Vui. And also there in hematology, there's also rituximab, which is very efficacious. And to answer your question, the most recent study I read where there was a high efficacy of targeted therapies was in 2021 from Van Tilburg about larotrectinib, which is an anti-RK fusion in anti-RK fusion positive tumors. And it had a great efficacy, and this study was not only pediatric but also for adults as well. And in both groups, in non-CNS solid tumors, it had a great efficacy. So this is one of the examples that could be used, but we have to mention that genetic testing should be done, and most of these targeted therapies should be targeting that kind of genetic alteration that we actually find with either next generational sequencing or fluorescent in situ hybridization and other techniques as well. And I think the second part of your question is if we find these drugs in these certain diseases, they can replace chemotherapy on the long run in the first-line treatment, but for others, there's still plenty of research to be done.
What is your clinical experience regarding the most common side effects of these two therapies, so chemo versus targeted therapy?
So the most prevalent difference between the two groups is hematological toxicities regarding the free cell lines, so myelosuppression, thrombocytopenia, and these are very common in these patients targeted with chemotherapy, so not targeted treatments. And in targeted treatments, skin like palmar erythema and skin rash, these are the most prevalent toxicities. But if given together, sometimes targeted therapies can also worsen hematological side effects, but it's mostly attributed to chemotherapy.
During the selection process, do you remember that how many articles must have been excluded because that adults and children data were handled together, so you couldn't include in your work that maybe, do you remember the portion of those?
I think by rough estimate at least 50 to 100 or maybe more, because during the selection process first we filtered out more than 22,000 articles, so it's hard to say after a while, but in the last selection part, in the after the title abstract selection, I think we filtered out around 100 at least.
Yeah, because then we can regard this unfortunately as data lost because you cannot contact.
In case of the Van Tilburg study, I actually contacted the authors of the study, so they sent me the presentation they gave on the pediatric population. So there's this possibility of contacting them. I've tried to contact several authors, but they were the only ones to reply.
Did you include to your population some vulnerable children, such as children with Down syndrome or something like that? Because we have evidence that these children has higher toxicity from chemos than other population, and it's just a kind of recommendation that, or now we are using targeted therapies for these children instead of chemos because of toxicity, and maybe it's an idea for analysis to watch it if it is really good for these children and have a statistical background for this thing. And have you ever considered to analyze this in specific population of these children?
When we did the analysis with Down syndrome, it was pediatric AML that they did the studies in, and they excluded the Down syndrome group. So they were actually in the exclusion criteria, and because this was the tumor that affected them the most, we didn't focus on this particular subgroup, because we already have CNS malignancies, non-CNS malignancies, and hematological malignancies as subgroups. So it's such a broad study that I think it would be such a small group in this whole collective field to analyze that there might be a lot of energy put in it with not a lot of comeback. But it would be nice to actually have a study based on these patients and their toxicity profiles.